Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Of course, tonight's learning is in the merit of all the Jewish people, wherever they may be, especially in the land of Israel, and especially those on the front lines defending the Jewish people. Let's get right into it. This week's Torah portion is Parsha Sarah. It's the week that Sarah passes away, and the week of the shidduch of the match of Isaac, of Yitzchak, that also happens in this week's Torah portion. Now, one of the things that is happens in this week's Torah portion is we have a little bit of a repetition of something that happened in last week's Torah portion, as follows. In last week's Torah portion, it says, "V'Avraham v'Sarah zakenim ba'im bayamim," that Abraham and Sarah were old; they were coming on in years. It's the literal translation, and it's in the context of how old Abraham and Sarah were when they had Isaac. Right? They had Isaac at Abraham was 100. And Sarah was 90. So it was in that context. And then later in this week's Torah portion, it says, Abraham Zakim Baba Yamim. Abraham was old and he was coming on in years. So the obvious question is, if you told me in last week's Torah portion, before Isaac is born, that Abraham is old, and this week's Torah portion is 38 years later, following the Akedah, following the binding of Isaac, which was Isaac was 37. So if you count from before he was born, a year before he was born, so this is 38 years later. So if he was old 38 years ago, he's for sure old now. So why are you telling me that he's old? Before we get to that, though, let's understand what does it mean ba'im bayamin, coming on in years. So, some people want to say that maybe it means that he was coming on in years, like it just kept on coming or whatever. If we look though in scripture, King David is also described as ba'im bayamim. So it means coming on in years. But if we translate it literally, we try to understand this. Coming on in years means coming into the years. What does it mean coming into the years? Is that the events of his life were not things that just passed over him, that happened to him, but rather he experienced these things, and it actually affects a person, right? When you experience something, it affects the way you look, it affects your mindset, and it makes a mark on you. So when it says that Abraham was old, it means, or King David was old, or Sarah was old, that all the events of their life had an effect on them. And it's not like they just passed through life, but actually every single thing they had an effect on him. Now, specifically when it comes to the things that had an effect, was when it comes to King David, it was he had problems with his had a lot of wars, had a serious effect on him. He had problems with his children. His own son rebelled against him. So we see here that King David had this idea of coming on years, and the same thing is so too with Abraham. Is that when Abraham and Sarah were 199 or 99 and 98 respectively, they were old, and everything they took to heart. It makes sense. When your whole life, you take everything to heart, what you go through in your life. But what the Torah is telling us, the Torah is telling us that not only did Abraham that for the first 100 years of his life, but for another 38 years, which were actually very pivotal years, because Isaac is born, he raises Isaac to the point that he brings him as an offering to God. That these years were not just years that just happened. Well, you think, okay, already he was 100 years old. Life is moving on. Perhaps, he wasn't taking things to heart anymore. He's okay. I lived my life. I had 100 good years. But no, in fact, that these years actually had just as much an effect as the previous years. That he turned 100 and life wasn't happening to him. He was still happening to life. He was still experiencing all these things, and these are really pivotal moments in his life, even though they happened even though they happened after the age of 100. Now, Another thing that the Zohar tells us is that this idea of Ba'im Bayamim means that every single day we're completely devoted to God. That's what it means, Ba'im Bayamim, that every single day is completely devoted to God. And we can understand this based on what we just explained, that every single day had meaning that the true life of Abraham and Sarah, and obviously King David, that these special people, their physical life wasn't eating breakfast, lunch, and supper. Their meaning in life was their spirituality. So it's a little bit of both. That every single thing they experienced, they took to heart. But what was those experiences that they took to heart? Were the spiritual experiences that they went through. There's a famous story about a yeshuvnik. Yeshuvnik is somebody who lived in a little village somewhere in deep in Russia, and they didn't have any opportunities for education. So what they would do is they would hire a few families together that lived on a farm or a village. They would hire a malamed, a teacher, and this teacher was somebody who had a little bit of education, but the yeshuvniks themselves many times were totally illiterate. So one time, the story goes that this yeshuvnik gets a letter in the mail. He gets a letter in the mail, and what do you do with a letter? He can't read. So he goes to the malamed. He goes to the teacher that they hired for their children. And they go to the teacher, and he says, "Can you please read me this letter?" So the yeshuvnik listens, and he reads the letter. And what does he read in the letter? That the yeshuvnik's father, this villager, his father had passed away. And when he hears that, he faints. And the malamed is thinking, I'm this big intellectual, and I read this letter. It's a nice letter, but it's nothing that impressive about it, right? So what's this idea here? That he fainted from this letter, and the obvious answer is that it's his father, right? That it could be for the malamed, it's an intellectual exercise of a reading a letter. But when it comes down to it, it's this person's father. So that is kind of when it comes to Abraham, he took his life very seriously. Even at the age of 138, he was still taking his life seriously because he was involved in the spiritual pursuits that were extremely important to him. Now, if we go to the beginning of the Torah portion, we see a similar idea. It says, the Torah portion starts off, Vayucha Sarah, and it was the years of Sarah, Me'as Shana, Ve'esrim Shana, V'Sheva Shanim. It was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years, which is a very funny way of saying things. In Hebrew, if you want to say, it's just like in English, if you want to say somebody is 127 years old, you say, she lived 127 years. Instead, the Torah says, 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. So Rashi says, what does it mean that each of why are they these three separate units of 120 and 7? So Rashi explains that they were all identical in good. So the obvious question is, how could it be that these 127 years were all equally good? A person goes through life, any person, not just people who are that we know about, but any person, they go through life. There's ups, there's downs, there's good days, there's bad days. They have good experiences, they have bad experiences. They might get through it. They might be special people that could overcome it, but there's hard days. And we know that the life of Avram and Sarah, they had tough things. She was infertile for 90 years. They had, before they discovered God, they had life after discovering God. They had life before they came to the land of Israel. They had life after they came to the land of Israel. So how could it be? That you could say that Sarah's life was all identically good? And the truth is, because it wasn't that, like we said earlier, it wasn't that the good of her life was the regular daily experiences of eating like breakfast, going to sleep, doing laundry, whatever she was doing. That wasn't the things that made her life her life. If we go to what is the life of Sarah, we said it's the life of Sarah. What does it mean, the life of something? The life of a person, and especially a tzaddik, is not something. It's not just like we said, the breakfast, lunch, and supper, but rather the Torah tells us that, and it's Rashi explains that there were three things that defined Sarah's life. That there was always candles burning from one Friday to the next. She was careful about lighting Shabbos candles; they would actually burn the entire week. There was blessing in her dough, and a protective cloud of divine presence hovering over her tent, and which alludes to the three mitzvahs that were given to women, which are, of course, lighting Shabbos candles, challah, doing the mitzvah of taking challah, and family purity, of purity in the home. And so we see here that the life of Sarah were these spiritual ideas, which even though these mitzvahs are specific mitzvahs, it's the idea of you know the focal point of her life were Shabbos candles, keeping kosher, family purity, taking care of the home, making an atmosphere in the home. These were the things that defined her life. And therefore, because these were the things that defined her life, those things never changed. In those things, life was always good. And yes, there were ups, there were downs, they had challenges, they had good days, they had bad days. But what defined her life, when it comes to life, life was these important things. Now, the question is, so you're saying that if you want to have a good life, you have to always have equal in good, right? So the question is, what about people? Not all the time. Are we able to? Not all the time. Are we able to always have everything equal and good? We as human beings, we're not Sarah, that we fail. And if we're saying that the solution for a Jewish woman to have purity in her life is to focus on family purity, to focus on kosher in the home, to focus on lighting Shabbat candles in the Shabbos of the home. These things are the things that make a Jewish woman. But what happens when we fail? Whether it's a Jewish woman or a Jewish man, when we fail in these things, how are we able to correct them? How are we able to kind of move forward from them and to make sure everything is in good? And the truth is that when it comes to rectifying the past, it's something that is uniquely in Judaism, is that the Torah tells us we can do teshuvah. We can rectify the past. And one of the ways of doing that, besides taking obviously a resolution that you're, to strengthen those areas in your personal life, is also to encourage others in those things. When a person for whatever reason, has a failure in his own life in something, the solution is to take that thing that he failed at and try to, besides bolstering himself, to bolster others. To kind of say, yes, I failed in this idea, I failed in something, but I'm going to now take what I learned and teach others why it's so important to do this mitzvah. Why is it so important to be involved in this Jewish thing? Whether in this case we're talking about the identity of a Jewish woman, but whatever it may be, any type of failure that we have, it's not enough to just say, well, I failed and I learned my lesson. It was a very difficult lesson, but to say, I don't want that to happen to somebody else. And I want to teach somebody else the beauty of Torah, the beauty of mitzvahs, the beauty of whatever failure I had, to make sure that it never happens to somebody else. And in this way, we can be like Sarah and be complete in our days. That we can have days that, again, focusing our life is not just the things that the material things that we have, the physical pursuits that we have, but our lives are Torah, our lives are mitzvahs, our lives are our focus and our duties to the Jewish home and our Jewish communities. I want to wish everybody a good Shabbos and looking forward to seeing you next week.